talk about gut disorders and some of the issues here in the US or worldwide. I use this graph, and it shows us the increase in inflammatory bowel disease specifically worldwide. Different countries, Germany, Japan, Sweden, a lot of industrialized nations are noted on here. But I could use a lot of slides from a lot of chronic illnesses, and true or false, most of them are going to look something like this. Since the 1960s to present, there's a massive increase in chronic illness across the board. Autoimmune diseases, dementia, autism. All these graphs are going to look similar because there are massive changes that are going on in our environment leading to this. So we're going to be speaking specifically about inflammatory bowel for the next few minutes, but just recognize the fact that this is a trend that we're all seeing with all of our patients. True or false? Are you seeing trends like this? Yes, exactly. So currently, roughly about 4 million people in the US have a peptic ulcer. 11% of the population has some version of IBS. 1.3 million suffer from some version of inflammatory bowel disease, whether that's Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. 25 to 30% of those are kids, under 20 at least. And roughly a prevalence of 100 to 200 out of 100,000 children in the US suffer from some type of inflammatory bowel disease, and about almost 50 out of 100,000 worldwide. Interestingly, the cases in pediatrics are actually exceeding, in terms of increased prevalence, are exceeding that of adults. And the thing is this, and I think most people in the room know this, but the prevalence is changing at such a rate that we cannot blame genetics alone for this problem. The genetic code of the human has not changed anywhere near at the rate that these diseases are all changing. So we can have a graph of the genetic code of the human for the last 5,000 years. It's going to be pretty flat. Yet all these chronic illnesses we see skyrocketing over the last 30 and 40 years. So if we have a graph that looks like this, we can't blame graphs that look like that I showed you before, that they're not correlated. So we can't just sit here and say, well, the genes are just mutating, we have all kinds of changes going on. It's a huge issue of environmental changes, and that's really what we need to start looking at. I know the people in here know that. And we need to start broadening our concept for what we're looking to do for these patients. Right now, at least in terms of inflammatory bowel disease, but really most autoimmune diseases, the goal is suppression of the symptoms. Can we control the symptoms in this patient so that they can have a modest quality of life? Can we suppress these symptoms long enough to either delay the surgery or hopefully prevent the surgery? But ultimately, we're not looking at, can we heal this? We're looking at, how can we just manage this better for the course of this person's life? And I'm here to say that I don't think that that's really the case. It doesn't have to be that way. These are conditions that have causes. And if they have conditions that have causes, and we actually look a little bit deeper, we can get into some of those causes, and we can correct those. And if we start correcting causes, we can heal. And that's really what we're talking about today. If we can create systems that improve the speed or the ability in general for the body to heal, if we look at bigger factors outside the genes, if we look at diet, if we look at the environment, we could start to really get deeper into the cause of a lot of these autoimmune conditions. And ultimately, if we could find new therapies that could affect the human body in a meaningful way, then we could start to heal. And so what I want to say is that the evaluation and management of microbiome is sort of that next frontier. I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but there was a point where we were, the Human Genome Project, we were saying, well, once we know that, once we crack that code, we're going to know why everybody gets everything. And then we said, wait, there are not enough genes to support that theory, so we need to look at something else. And so epigenetics was born out of that issue, saying, listen, there's got to be other triggers, things that turn these genes on and off, signals that affect our genetic code and tell our body what to do. And so epigenetics came from that. And what I want to say is that also the microbiome is sort of that next evolution. There's also, we're going to talk about this more in a few minutes, but the interaction between our microbial environment, the colonies, we're basically just skin-covered petri dishes, the environment of our bacterial, fungal, and viral colonies that live in us also interact with our DNA and change our response to that environment. So evaluating that in a meaningful way and then having therapies to deal with the microbiome can be a huge implication for helping patients, just like you heard over lunch with Alzheimer's. So how does the microbiome become dysfunctional? Before we get into that, I want to talk about what is the microbiome. For those who don't know, I'm sure we covered it an hour ago. But it's basically all the bacteria, fungus, viruses, all the little microorganisms that live in us and on us. Like I said, we are skin-covered petri dishes. We have more microbes living in us and on us than we have cells that make us up by about tenfold at least. And we share. We're symbiotic in theory. We give them a home. We provide them with food, right? And they live inside of us. They help us deal with that food. They help digest our food. They make certain nutrients for us. They change our hormone levels. They change our neurotransmitters. There's a whole beautiful interaction between our cells and all of these microbes, assuming that the microbiology is healthy. But as soon as we create issues in the environment that is our body, and the environment starts to become conducive to pathogens, as opposed to symbiotic probiotics, then we start to have consequences. And that's ultimately what we want to look at. We want to look at what is the environment that dictates who lives there, because ultimately we need to change, just like that last slide at lunch. Diet and lifestyle changes your microbiome. We have to start there because it's the internal environment that dictates which bugs live there. You could add probiotics and shift it a little bit, let's say. You could take an antibiotic and shift that a little bit, but those are temporary solutions. Whatever bugs live there because that environment is conducive to allow them to live there. And if we can change that environment negatively, we could have a lot of health consequences. And if we can change that environment to affect it positively, then we can improve our health by doing so. So we're going to do a little bit more of this later on, but just in general, what does the microbiome do for us? They provide us with certain vitamins, minerals, nutrients, hormones, neurotransmitters. They help us digest our food. They interact extensively with our immune system. And of course, there's the whole gut-brain axis. So there's a whole interaction between our gut and our immune system and our gut and our nervous system, our brain. But the most important thing, I think, to know about this is it's not permanent. It's a very sensitive system, and it changes quickly, and it changes dramatically to very small shifts in our life. And so we need to learn what those are, because when we know them, we can have a positive effect. And when we don't know them, we don't realize the consequences of our decisions. We don't realize what we're eating, what we're doing, what we're thinking, how much stress we have, what we're smoking, what environment we're in, who we're making out with. These are all different things that affect our microbiome, right? And so we want to make sure that we're making really healthy decisions that affect our body to make sure that we can affect that microbiome the way we want to. So what are some of those causes of dysfunction? There are a lot, but here's just a few. How about some drugs? Obviously, antibiotics affect that system. It kills bugs. Kills good guys and bad guys. It's a temporary shift, but it's a meaningful shift. Steroids also obviously impact that. But listen, it's not just those that are so obvious that affect our immune system or the bugs themselves. Taking SSRIs or taking hormone replacement. If the microbiology affects our chemistry at that level, which it does, then taking drugs that affect that chemistry will also have an effect on the microbiome. You cannot separate those two by any way. But it's not just the drugs we take on purpose, right? We have massive antibiotic use in the feed supply for the animals, right, that are basically become some of our food. And so we have to realize that we have to make choices, not just, hey, what am I going to either take or not take as a drug, but when I'm eating food, is that food containing antibiotics? You are what you ate, but you are what you're eating ate. And so if the food supply is disturbed, which it is, for the animal, then the food supply that we're going to get access to is also going to be disturbed similarly. And that's going to have massive effects on our microbiology. Pesticides, another huge one. To name one, glyphosate, who's familiar? Of course. They just lost a huge lawsuit. And there's a lot more coming. So, but here's what's interesting, right? It works on this thing called the shikimate pathway. The shikimate pathway, in theory, doesn't interact with human cells. So they were able to utilize this as a pesticide, dump tons and tons of gallons of this chemical on our food because it's safe for human consumption, because humans don't have a shikimate pathway, therefore we should be fine. The issue is we have 10 times more bacteria than we have cells, and bacteria have a shikimate pathway. And so all this food that's contaminated with all of these chemicals, which theoretically have no interaction with our chemistry, have an enormous interaction with our microbiology. And it's basically an antibiotic. So every day that we consume foods covered in glyphosate is literally every day we're taking an antibiotic without even realizing it. Having a huge change and a huge shift in that microbiome. Another cause of changes in our microbiome is hypoxia. So these bacteria, some bacteria love oxygen, some hate oxygen, some tolerate oxygen. But what happens when we have especially inflammatory gut issues or inflammatory issues in general, we get tissue damage. If we have tissue damage, we have circulation damage. And if we have circulation damage, we cannot oxygenate that area well. And that's one of the reasons that these chronic illnesses that won't heal, especially ulcers or wounds, it has a lot to do with this chronic hypoxia that the body is exposed to in these times of inflammation and tissue breakdown. So if the gut, let's just say, if the gut has this damage and has this relative hypoxia, you're going to note that it's going to shift the environment. And if it shifts the environment, you're going to start to allow bacteria that are anaerobic start to really thrive. And you're going to have bacteria that are either aerobic or at least oxygen tolerant, they start to decrease in number. And so again, we have to realize is it's all the environment. Change the environment, you change the bugs. So if we want inflammatory, hypoxic, loving bacteria, which happen to be mostly pathogens living in our gut, then we can eat this food, we can take these drugs, we can have antibiotics, it doesn't matter. But if ultimately we're looking for healthy probiotics, things that want oxygen or at least tolerant to oxygen, and we want our body to be capable of healing, we need to create this environment that's conducive to those bacteria living there. Certain foods are also going to affect the microbiome, obviously. It's one of the reasons why probably things like specific carbohydrate diet or FODMAP work. I mean, if you change your diet, you change your bugs every time. And so that's a really important thing to note. And then ultimately, like was covered in the other room, enough of this inflammation, enough of these pathogens are doing well, we get enough of a shift of inflammation, we get enough of a shift of tissue breakdown, we get enough to where we start to get intestinal permeability. You get intestinal permeability or leaky gut. Now we have an entire cascade of a whole other chronic inflammatory process. We're going to upregulate the immune system. It's basically the beginning of so many autoimmune and chronic illnesses that we're seeing today in our offices. So what's the physiology behind inflammatory butt disease? This is basically, I guess, what it is, right? Inflammatory bowel disease. There's acute and chronic inflammation, right? So we get these cytokines coming through. What they note, though, is that in chronic gut inflammation, there are higher levels of SIBO. So all of a sudden, you just know by default, I mean, if you think about it, if the gut's inflamed, if the gut is transitioning towards an unhealthy environment, you should start to see these pathogens really start to rise. And of course, that's what we see. And with that change, those bacteria, those pathogens are also implicated in so much of the damage that occurs while being affected by those pathogens. So the ulcers, the tissue damage, the fistulas, the fissures, a lot of that has to do with which bacteria are present and how much damage they're able to do in our system while they're there. The bacteria, especially the pathogens, they also lay down these biofilms. These biofilms happen to be homes that the bacteria can create around themselves, and that has two negative effects. One, it makes them really comfortable. It protects them. So they have a really beautiful, nice, cozy home to live in. But more importantly, it makes traditional therapies like antibiotics less effective because we can't penetrate that biofilm so well traditionally. So, again, we're getting these shifts that make the pathogens it's just too easy for them to thrive in that type of environment. So in summary of some of the changes that we see in the gut as a relation to changes in the microbiome, you'll start to see increases in inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, IL-8, TNF-alpha, many others. Ultimately, with that inflammation, you're going to start to get chronic wounds and chronic hypoxia due to the circulatory damage that's done. Once we get enough inflammation and enough circulatory damage, you're going to start to see those changes in the microbiome. Those pathogens start to really do well. Those probiotics really start to struggle. We get bacterial imbalance overall as a result. We get this biofilm development, and then ultimately, the body can't heal. We get a whole blockage of the epithelial layer of the skin, not having the right resources it needs ultimately to heal that tissue layer. This is a great slide. It's just everything I just said in more detail. You can read it. So basically, if we can change the environment, again, right? If we can change the environment, decrease the inflammation, increase the oxygen, especially if it's hypoxia, get proper nutrition, then we can find balance in the microbiome. And that's really the goal here, and that's what we're going to cover. So what are the other things that the microbiome happens to be able to do for us? Again, some vitamin production, assistance in digestion, immune balance, and gut-brain axis. So there's over 1,000 different bacterial species. There's probably more. Some studies say less. Some say 300 to 500, 600. Who knows? There's a lot. Okay? And within that huge amount of potential bacteria that we have, each of us probably has about 160 different species. It's a lot. About a third of that we might have in common. And we might have in common because we live in the same area, the same region. We might have them in common because somehow we're related to each other. So within families, we share some of these organisms. We might have them in common because we share body fluids periodically. Not you and I, maybe, but you know what I'm saying. So as we interact with our environment, those bugs also change. And so about a third of them we may have in common with other people near us or in our family, but 2/3 make us pretty well individual. And again, that goes back to the whole, gene theory saying, listen, there's not enough here to make all the differences between you and I. So between our gene code and epigenetics and now the microbiome and sharing that information, that DNA, now there's enough to make a difference between you and I. So that's really what we have to look at, that big picture. The gene set of the microbiota is 3 million genes. So it's 150 times what we have as individuals. So it's a massive amount. It's, just like it's more bacteria than cells, it's more DNA within that microbiome than our own cells. And so to think that that doesn't affect our health, would just be to miss a huge part of what we need to be focusing on. A large, diverse community that basically adds to our enzymes. They produce enzymes, they break down some of our foods, they change, we were saying before, they change our hormones, they change our neurotransmitters. And so I think what's interesting, fecal matter transplants, have you guys heard of those, right? So, we're tinkering with that a little bit. I think we need to learn a lot more about the microbiome before we get heavy into that. But it's really interesting because you could see massive changes, maybe in the area you thought you were going to, but maybe in areas you had no idea were even implicated. So a few examples, a case report. So this woman, after 16 months of a fecal matter transplant, she gained 34 pounds and her BMI went from 26 to 34.5. Basically became obese as a result of that. So that's where these bacteria are massively interacting with our metabolism, right? She wasn't obviously getting that transplant for this reason. This was a side effect of that. Fecal matter transplant, FMT, and autism. So GI, neuropsychosocial symptoms all improved within 10 weeks of an FMT. So all of a sudden, this kid got a fecal matter transplant, and they saw changes in his social behavior, in his neuro and cognitive abilities. Another case report, our study results suggest that depression and anxiety symptoms could be improved regardless of the GI symptoms. So you might have IBS and IBD, you might get a fecal matter transplant, and that may or may not help some of your GI complaints. But you could also expect that may also interact with your metabolism, your mood, right? Your neurotransmitters, your hormones. So it should be interesting and somewhat terrifying to think that, these organisms that we don't know that much about have such an influence over our entire biochemistry. A lot of times, in my opinion, on topics like this, is we don't know enough to be messing with it on that level sometimes. Our bodies are already inoculated with the bacteria that we need for our region, from our family, based on our environment. We just need to nourish it at a level that allows the good guys to outweigh the bad guys. And so we just need strategies for learning how to manipulate that in a way that's meaningful to actually gain those changes. So microbiome and vitamin production, this is just to name a few, but we feed them, they feed each other, and as a result, they feed us. So they produce some of the riboflavin and niacin that we need. They produce some of the B12 that we need. They produce a lot of the vitamin K that we need. They produce, but also help metabolize short-chain fatty acids, medium-chain fatty acids, and so they're helping to create metabolic shifts for us as well. They also make some of the essential amino acids. So here we are learning, in nutrition, here's 8 amino acids that if you don't eat them, you don't get them. Well, that might not be true. It might be that by eating other foods and feeding your microbiome properly, that your bacteria are actually going to make some of those essential amino acids for us. They also help break down insoluble fiber. So a couple quotes from a couple studies that I just thought are pretty meaningful. The gut microbiome has an enormous impact on the life of the host. The diet plays a fundamental role in shaping that microbiome, composition, and function. The way food is processed is a key factor determining the amount and type of material that the gut bacteria influencing their growth, production, of microbiome. So basically, again, what we eat, how we feed ourselves, the quality, quantity, and frequency that we feed ourselves massively changes the bacterial environment of our gut. Two more basically saying the same thing, but in summary, mounting evidence indicates that the way a food is designed will ultimately define the diversity of the microbiome metabolites. Here's what's interesting. If you eat the same food, whether it's healthy or not, if you eat the same foods all the time, you're going to feed the same bugs all the time. You're going to create monocultures, which we don't want. So having variety, we'll talk about this again in a few minutes, but having variety in that process, really changing things up, changing your diet massively, periodically, both in timing and in quantity and in quality, could really help improve the health of the microbiome. These recorded benefits and more have led to a growing interest in the ability to modify the gut microbiota. Check this out. In an acute change in your diet, literally going, let's say, plant-based to animal-based or animal-based to plant-based, in 24 hours of massively shifting your diet, you can see massive shifts in your bacteria. That's what I mean. This is a sensitive system that changes dramatically and quickly to the signals that we give it. Likewise, if you were plant-based and you went animal-based and you saw a shift in 24 hours and went back to plant-based, within about 2 days, you would get a normalization of your colonies back to the way it was before you did that. So this is a very delicate situation we're talking about. How about the microbiome and the immune system? So we see different numbers, but roughly 70–80% of our immune system is relating back to that gut microbiome. They're playing an enormous role in how they protect us. How do they do that? They help determine which antibodies we're going to make and when. They help balance the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cycles. They balance the Th1, Th2 system, and they massively influence the Th17, which is basically like the regulatory side of the immune system. So between these bacteria changing our antibodies or influencing our antibodies, influencing our cytokines or inflammatory responses, and then balancing or not the Th1, Th2, again, that's such a huge piece of how the microbiome affects this whole autoimmune, whether we're talking gut autoimmune or other, how the gut microbiome influences autoimmunity just as a whole. And then, of course, gut-brain axis. Need I say more than your lunch? If we don't know that by now, I think we got that covered, yes? All right, good. But you understand, it's huge, right? These bacteria are influencing your immune system, influencing your digestive, influencing your metabolism, influencing your brain. It's amazing. But here's it in a summary. Summary, one sentence, I think, really boiling it down. The catastrophic failure of human metabolism observed in autoimmune disease results from a common underlying pathogenesis, the successive accumulation of pathogens into the microbiome over time, and the ability of those pathogens to dysregulate transcription, translation, and the human metabolic process. This is true for all bugs. This is true for all autoimmune diseases. And this is the thing. You're a skin-covered petri dish, whether you want to be or not. No matter what, you're going to have 10 times more bugs in you and on you than you have cells. The question is, are they good guys or bad guys? The question is, are you influencing that system on purpose? Are you helping your patients to influence that system on purpose to make sure that you're helping create an environment that's going to allow for the synergistic, healthy probiotic to do well? Or are we going to ignore it and allow the pathogens to win? And ultimately, either way, they're gonna manipulate our DNA. The good guys will manipulate that DNA in a healthy way, improve our metabolism, neurotransmitters, hormone, and the pathogens are going to break that down. So mechanisms of HBOT, in like 4 sentences or less: pressurized environments increase your ability to absorb oxygen, period, okay? The part I want to add to this is just to say, I look at oxygen, my background is clinical nutrition. I look at oxygen as a nutrient more than I look at it as anything else. It's a nutrient that your body needs to function and do what it does every day. But the thing is this, you already have almost as much oxygen in your body as you can possibly carry, right? If you don't have a lung, heart, or circulatory disease, you're basically 97, 98% oxygenated as you sit here listening to me talk, which means at best, you can only get 1 or 2 or 3% more. Everybody follow that? But there's a time when megadosing oxygen might be appropriate, just like megadosing vitamin C might be appropriate. So if you don't get enough vitamin C, what do we call that? Scurvy. So we all try to get enough vitamin C to make sure we're not deficient, and so we don't get scurvy, but then some of us might say, hey, well, there's even more than that. You might want to get a little bit more and say there's an optimum range, because I don't want to just not get scurvy. I actually want to be healthy. So I'm going to get a little more vitamin C to make sure I have enough to do all the things vitamin C is going to do. And then even after I do that, periodically I might choose to megadose vitamin C as a way for me to maybe fight infection. Or maybe I need to megadose vitamin C drips for cancer, like we talked about a couple hours ago. So there's times where really high doses might be appropriate to heal from something. Well, oxygen's the same way. If you don't get enough oxygen, we have a name for that. It's called hypoxia. Sometimes that hypoxia is systemic because you have a cardiovascular disease or some sort of circulatory issue. But sometimes that hypoxia is local because you have tissue damage. That tissue damage might be in your gut from an autoimmune disease. That tissue damage might be physical from a fall or an injury of some kind. But you can have localized hypoxia. And if you're 98 or 99% saturated as you sit here, and you have local hypoxia, and you put that mask on your face from a green tank, you'll get 2%, but that's not enough to make a difference. So periodically, you need to megadose oxygen as a way to create a surplus that allows your body to heal in a meaningful way. And as it stands, hyperbaric oxygen right now is basically the only tool we have to be able to do that. It works by 2 laws, Boyle's law and Henry's law. They talked about it, so we'll skip it. It's amazing. It increases your blood flow, your free-floating oxygen. It helps get oxygen to places that it can't get to due to circulatory damage. It's a long story, we don't have time. It has an angiogenic effect, so ultimately you'll heal, create new blood flow, so that once you're out of the hyperbaric oxygen environment long-term, you now have a new highway to carry that excess oxygen, so you can maintain that over time. And then there's a dissipation effect also. But we have 10 minutes, so we're not going to cover it. You can ask me later. Anyway, how do we start healing the microbiome? We showed this before. Basically, what do we need to do? We need to control inflammation. We need to repair the oxygenation of a hypoxic area. We need to provide proper nutrition, and if we do that, we can create that balance in the microbiome. So how does hyperbaric oxygen affect that? It actually affects all 4 of those areas. okay? Hyperbaric oxygen has a direct effect on inflammatory cytokines. It reduces the entire inflammatory cascade of events. It acts as an antibiotic for pathogens. So anaerobes can't survive in that high oxygen environment, and as a result, they actually start to die off. At the same time, probiotics that happen to love oxygen thrive. So now you're feeding them a nutrient that they need to improve. So all of a sudden, you're shifting your microbiome automatically just from changing the oxygen level. Again, I think oxygen is a nutrient. That's how I look at it. So I look at oxygen as being part of the process of recreating a balanced nutritional profile for ourselves. So, I mean, you could read through these, but this is basically a whole list of what you could expect from hyperbaric oxygen and its effect on ultimately healing and on the microbiome. Covered it. Sorry, I'm rushing, but kicking me out here soon. Real quick, I just want to talk about HBOT and ATP production. You know, the mitochondria is an organelle. Some people talk about the mitochondria that also was a bacteria once upon a time. It's interesting, it probably was. It's actually the only organelle we have that has its own genetic code. What's interesting is it doesn't have a full genetic code, it has a partial genetic code. Why? Because it relies on us to fill in that gap. So here's one example where I'm saying that we share genes and we help each other. Our genetics help fill in the gap where the mitochondria's genetics sort of leave off. And there's a symbiotic relationship. We feed that mitochondria short chain, medium chain, long chain fatty acids, glucose, and then that mitochondria turns around and starts whipping up ATP and feeds us the energy we need for our life. So there's, again, this beautiful symbiotic relationship between, you know, our cells and the bacteria in our body. But from a hyperbaric environment, you can expect that you'll see an increased efficiency of that mitochondria to be able to produce ATP. As it turns out, we haven't looked at this, we started looking at it now, but for a long time, we didn't realize, I don't think, that oxygen might be a rate limiting factor for electron transport in general. So all of a sudden, if you increase the oxygen available to that mitochondria, you're actually going to increase the rate of ATP production. Also, as a result of being in that high pressurized environment and getting more oxygen than we normally can, you're going to see an increase in size, shape, and density of the mitochondria. The body's going to say, listen, look at all this oxygen. We can't let that go to waste. Let's get the organelle that produces the energy for us, and let's upregulate it. Let's make it bigger. Let's make it stronger. Let's get more of them so that we can actually make use of all that excess oxygen. Microbiome and nutrition. So, I mean, again, you probably heard a lot of this about an hour ago. So, but what I want to say is, if you eat inflammatory, processed, drug-filled, pesticide-filled food, you should expect an inflammatory gut. Is that fair? You should also expect, which we don't think about, monocultures to develop. You're going to have a very specific line of bacteria that thrive, that love that inflamed, simplified diet. And we see that with a lot of kids that we treat, don't we? And we know that a lot of kids that we treat have these gut issues, and we're constantly trying to work this, shift in diet into their life because we know that there's some gut-brain connection, but here it is, we're laying it out. It's an enormous connection between the health, the vitality, the diversity of gut bacteria that we have and the general health that we'll experience as a result of that. So here's some recommendations that we share with our patients. We don't tell them to do all of these at the same time, they have to do some. Again, if you can create diversity and variety in your life and your diet, you can create diversity and variety in your gut and your gut health, and then you can improve your health. So these are just things that we use. We use a lot of fasting, intermittent fasting, block fasting. Interesting enough, a lot of fasting or ketosis in general was used as a tool for epilepsy because there's such a shift in the brain chemistry, the GABA to glutamate ratios become much more favored in GABA. So there's this great effect that has on seizure activity. But the more we look at it, some of that might be ketone-based, because as our brain utilizes ketones for energy instead of glucose, we get that nice shift of GABA-glutamate. But also, because of the gut bacteria and how they break those ketones down as well, that's another place that they're seeing a shift in the GABA-glutamate ratios. So again, the microbiota of our gut is helping that process. Also, as a result of fasting, we can shift our fat from white fat, which is basically, adipose accumulation, glucose accumulation in our body as stored fat, versus brown fat, which is actually metabolic. It's thermogenic. It creates heat for us. And as a result of fasting and the effect that fasting has on our microbiome, we can start to shift our fat stores from white fat to brown fat, making that fat, one, less, two, useful, as opposed to just being storage. So some guidelines that we use for our patients, again, you'll see this in your book, but eat a little less often, right? We say in some of the other groups that we're in, don't eat less often. Challenge your system a little bit. Don't eat every 3 hours. Try 3 meals a day instead of 6 meals a day. Try going 12 hours overnight without some food. Try stretching that a little further, right? Give your body a chance to make some of its own energy. Challenge your system healthy. Healthy challenges, adaptation is health. The more we can challenge our system to grow and adapt, the healthier our cells will become every time. Have variety. Have variety in the amount of food that you eat. Have a variety in the timing of your food that you eat. Have a variety in the types of food that you eat. Creating variety in your food creates variety and diversity in your gut microbiome. And so that's really critical, I think, for helping to change that microbiota that we're trying to shift. There's more of the same. All good, fabulous. Things to avoid, obviously, hopefully, refined sugars, grains, alcohol, caffeine, dairy. Again, if you basically eat inflamed foods, processed foods, chemical-laden foods, you're going to shift your bacteria in that direction. And if you eat whole foods, raw foods, if you don't eat for periods of time, all these other little challenges, you can create a shift back in the healthy direction. Fabulous. Read the book. The book is great. Read it. It's fabulous. Read it. Oh, I'm going backwards. Here we go. All right, so real quick, I have like 2 minutes. So just a couple cases. Here we go. 18-year-old male, home for a winter break from college. His diagnosis, ulcerative colitis, active fistula, active anal fissure. He's on Humira, he's on corticosteroids, he was in the middle of a pretty big flare. He's also been prescribed iron, just prescription iron. So basically, 10 to 14 bowel movements daily, urgency super high, frequencies obviously super high, blood in the stool, moderate cramping. It's a pretty tough situation. They were recommending basically really high dose corticosteroids. Let's get this under control for the rest of this semester. And then in the summer, we'll do a partial colon resectomy and get rid of the inflamed colon. So his medical doctor, who we know pretty well, sends him to our office for an evaluation. We do our thing. We recommend 20 sessions hyperbaric oxygen, 1.5 atmospheres, 100% oxygen, 90 minutes, 6 days a week. So he basically had a decrease in frequency of blood in the stool. He went back to school at 1 to 2 bowel movements instead of 10 to 14. He still had blood, but it was present less than half of the time. He had some evidence of fistula healing, and he had almost no cramping. So he did pretty well the next semester in the spring. Things were relatively under control, but he saw a huge increase in his symptoms come finals week. He associates stress with a flare. I think most people do. So he came back. He was trying to decide between, am I going to do this colon resection or not? They were pleased with the response that they had initially, so we did 40 more sessions. 60 minutes, 5 days a week. Complete resolution of the fistula and the fissure, no blood in the stool, no cramping, bowel movements 1 to 2 times a day. Still on Humira, not on the steroids, 18 months later, symptom-free. So here you're talking about some simple shift, right? In this case, we didn't even do nutrition. The other 2 cases that are in the book, we talk about doing nutrition. We fast a lot of these people because if you could fast them, even if it's just intermittent, by condensing their eating window, you're going to condense their bathroom window. And if you do nothing else for these people but condense their bathroom window, they are massively appreciative of that. right? So if you can shift them in a way that you can just reduce their frequency and urgency, that's a huge shift for them. In this case, all we did was the hyperbaric. We still had a massive shift. The other two cases are in there, but I think I'm pretty well out of time. So anyway, thank you much. If you have questions,